Hey guys, so we're MakerDAO, and we're building Dai, which is an asset-backed stablecoin. And so just to kind of get a sense for who we have here in the room, how many of you guys have heard about Maker? How many of you guys know about Dai? All right, so you guys are experts. Okay, so
that's good.
That's actually great. So
maybe
the way
we should just introduce yourselves.
Sure. So I'm Nick. I'm a developer at MakerDAO, and I'm primarily focusing on our Oracle infrastructure at the moment.
And
Sure. This better?
How's my sound?
Good.
Okay, great. Yeah, and I'm Rune. I'm co-founder and CEO of the foundation.
Okay, so hopefully the first few minutes aren't too boring for some of you guys who are already experts, as I just saw. But for the other people in the room, we want to give kind of a really brief kind of rundown of how Dai actually works from an implementation kind of perspective. And feel free to kind of chime in with questions, on the go. Just like raise your hand or just speak up. We want this to be kind of an interactive session, and much less of just us sitting here, preaching to you guys, right? So, at the core of kind of the Dai credit system, we have what's called a CDP. And a CDP is a smart contract, and it stands for kind of a collateralized debt position. And essentially, what we do is we lock up assets in these CDPs as effectively collateral, and then we borrow in Dai against that collateral. And this is where we get a really unique property about Dai, which kind of ensures the stability, is in the fact that it's over-collateralized. So the sense is that you can never kind of have get one-to-one in terms of a loan to your collateral amount, right? You need more collateral so that in the event that the price of your collateral asset drops, right, we can liquidate the CDP, and we have enough of a buffer in terms of the collateral value versus the loan value to ensure that we liquidate it in time, right? Any questions about that? Because that's a fundamental part of Dai.
Who's the buyer for the assets?
So the buyer is pretty much anyone, right? So are you
where is it traded? Maybe is a better question.
So are you talking about the collateral assets or Dai?
So if a CDP gets liquidated, where and how does that happen?
So effectively in multi-collateral Dai, what we have is an auction kind of mechanism. So let's say the debt on a CDP is 500 outstanding Dai. So we trigger an auction that needs to raise 500 Dai, right? And so every bid is effectively every bid, right, it's bidding, 5 Dai, 10 Dai, 100 Dai, and we're trying to get up to 500 Dai. And as soon as we get up to 500 Dai in the auction, then the kind of auction flips into a reverse auction. And what that means is that, all right, well, the auction at first will give you all of the collateral, right, up until 500 Dai, and now people are bidding against each other in terms of how little of the collateral they will accept while still giving that 500 Dai, right?
And does it time out? Like how does the auction end?
So there is a absolute kind of a timeout interval, as well as a kind of a interval after since the last bid, right? So exactly, make sense? Cool. So one of the core tenets of multi-collateral Dai is that right, you use a diverse array of kind of collateral assets. So up until now, single collateral Dai has only been using Ethereum. And while that has worked pretty well, even in very turbulent market circumstances, the real promise and real power of multi-collateral Dai is going to come in when we bring in all of these different assets and allow us to kind of hedge risk a little bit more, right? And right, so we can bring in something like a Digix, like gold-backed token, right? So which is not correlated to right, the up and down movements of crypto, right? It's more correlated to right, the price of gold. And right, and when we start seeing the tokenization of all kinds of different assets, so let's say we start seeing the tokenization of stocks, the tokenization of bonds, right? Tokenization of all kinds of you know, physical assets as well. We're really going to be able to kind of hedge the risk a lot more, to the point where if one kind of type of collateral just fails, you know, has a black swan event and goes to zero, hopefully it's just a very small part of the total collateral portfolio. So we kind of limit our exposure in that way, and that's going to ensure kind of DAI's long-term stability. So I think that's probably good enough for an explanation of how things work. But what we're really here today is Ruin is about to tell you guys how we can now, once we use these CDPs as a basis, kind of this like base layer infrastructure, what we can actually build on top of this. And it's actually quite fascinating. So Ruin, do you want to tell people like a little bit more on how you can flip this system on its head and create synthetic assets out of this?
Yeah, so we were betting that you guys would be very much in the know. That's why we chose such a like technically deep subject, I guess you can say, right? Because I mean, this explanation here is already like at the very, you know, like it can be hard for people to even grasp that part of Maker, and now we're getting like even deeper. So feel free to like stop me at any time and basically like let's keep this very conversational, because it is. Yeah, it's kind of like we're taking the most advanced smart contract system and now we're like sort of squaring the complexity of it. But basically, like Nick was saying, the fundamental thing you can do once you have this CDP engine, you have this multi-collateralized stablecoin system, is you can actually, instead of using volatile collateral to create a stable asset, as sort of the output, right, a stablecoin, you can actually do the opposite. You can use stable collateral to create like a volatile output. So like a coin that targets something volatile. And that's what we call a synthetic asset. So basically, really the gist of it is that you can use the same smart contracts that are used to generate the DAI stablecoin with to just create literally any kind of like target asset that you want. So that could be something like synthetic gold or synthetic oil or synthetic real estate index, or yeah, literally anything. And sometimes when people are told about this, then they like start asking, what about this and what about that kind of, and basically the answer is always yes. Like you can actually create a synthetic asset of whatever you want, just like you can do it with, you know, it's like the same logic as derivatives essentially. So that's actually like, I mean, it's a pretty huge deal, because that actually means that all the assets that are not readily available on the blockchain and that people want to get exposure to in some form, they can always get that using Maker essentially. And another really cool feature of this is like the marginal cost of creating these new synthetic assets with the existing infrastructure we already have is extremely low. So it's like anything there's demand for is going to be really easy to stand up. And really all you need to do, like I was saying before, like is really, you're just reusing the exact same system, right? So it's not like a synthetic asset is some new type of like smart contract setup. It's actually just another stablecoin where you just essentially flip it, right? You have the stable collateral and then you have a volatile target.
So just going one step back, why are you doing this?
Yeah, why creating
synthetic assets?
Yeah, I mean, so I guess I would say there's a number of different reasons why you want to do it. One could be that it's to create exposure to an asset that people just can't get access to already. So that could be something like, you know, so right now there's Digix Gold, right? There's tokenized gold going to be available in the blockchain. But there's not currently any plans, as far as I've seen, for someone to make, let's say, tokenized platinum or something like that. So there's like other precious metals, just as an example, in addition to gold, that people may want to have exposure to, but not necessarily have the ability to buy a token that is like an IOU for a one-to-one digit style. And that's where creating synthetic assets is just like a really straightforward way to enable people to get that demand filled. The other reason why you might to use is because that's, in some situations, synthetic assets will actually be very liquid, even compared to something like, let's say, digital gold. So like there might actually be a demand for synthetic gold that is sort of like has a different, just like for a different type of user than something like digital gold or similar IOU gold tokens, because potentially it will be more liquid because it's and that's what's interesting about it, is like the synthetic asset doesn't come out of like a real gold somewhere, right? Because it really just is like a completely sort of made up synthetic asset. So every single token of synthetic assets are created when someone else shorts that asset into existence, basically. So something like synthetic gold shows up when, obviously there has to be enough demand in the first place to create a viable market, but then every token of the synthetic gold is created by someone who actually has DAI and wants to keep their exposure to DAI, sort of CDP style, right? They think that right now everything, like the sort of the market, like they're happy having a stable asset, and they in fact believe that the market for gold is going to fall. So they decide to generate some synthetic gold and sell it off, and now they have some debt denominated in gold that they then later can pay back. Hopefully they'll pay it back at a lower price. Just like, it's kind of like the same logic as a CDP, except here you're betting on the value of the target asset falling rather than the value of collateral increasing.
So can you just spell it out? What is the ingredients list to create a synthetic copper?
Synthetic copper?
That's the topic.
It's actually very simple. It's, number one, it's like the multi-collateral Dai smart contract setup like system. And then number two, it's a price feed for the price of copper. And then of course an active market. There has to be some if you literally just deploy that, then you will get some strange, without really having enough for a liquid market. Then obviously the asset will be very strange and not really very useful. But if there's just some level of kind of market activity to the point where people will start arbitraging, for instance, so they would do stuff like they would short copper, and then they would go long copper somewhere else, and then they'd essentially be able to market make it like that. Then you actually get something where a buyer of this synthetic copper asset will just be pretty, it's going to be a pretty good substitute for just acquiring copper in some way.
What's the minimum viable liquidity needed for an asset to for the real asset to create a synthetic counterpart? Does it have to be a live market, or say could you do it for Uber shares where every 18 months there's a new price that gets marked up, right?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say that it has to be real-time liquid. You could, it just really changes the properties of the synthetic asset if it's very binary. Of course, from a technical point of view, nothing prevents you from using a price feed that changes every 18 months. It's just probably there's not going to be so much demand for it. Yeah, it's hard to say, but at first, we're going to go very much from the low-hanging fruit, which will be very, very basic assets.
Do you think that there's a risk of the adoption, adoption growing so big that somebody who can act on the underlying markets can by that force liquidations by moving the market price by much smaller volumes than what would be needed to because the liquidity has gone down, but the liquidity has grown a lot on the collateralized positions. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I see your point. So you're talking about the entire market for an asset moving to synthetic assets and away from the real markets. And I would say that's probably, it's a very theoretical case, but I think that sort of for fundamental, macroeconomic reasons, that's not going to happen, because there'll always be slightly more efficiency, or you'll always be slightly better off by holding the real physical asset. On the other hand, though, of course, the thing is that for long-term holding, you're always better off having the real thing. But for a trader, or if you're doing quick trades, sometimes synthetic assets are more liquid and better to deal with in that sense. So, there's definitely a risk that has to be considered. But I think actually that's also something that you can build into the price feeds themselves. So you could actually consider like the price discovery for a synthetic asset as being a part of the overall price discovery for like the asset class as a whole, at least on a very short term, so that you have to sort of verify that if someone is like pushing around the physical market, but the synthetic assets are remaining relatively stable, you need to be able to you need to verify whether or not the synthetic asset market is going to follow the physical market, or whether it's actually more like a flash crash essentially. So that's just like, I mean, that's a good example of the kind of manipulation and kind of like strange behavior that synthetic assets and even the DAI system in general has to deal with through its oracles, and really apply signal processing and kind of make sure that the system doesn't get screwed over by like bad data or like strange behavior that really, like if you had a human sort of watching this kind of stuff, they would be like, something's wrong here, you know, abort, kind of, don't do something stupid. And it's very important that you don't, that the smart contract system doesn't just go like, just like mindlessly follow sort of the input without having any sort of sanity check on it. So that's still something that is being sort of thought out in general, how we actually really protect this stuff. And again, yeah, that's relevant both for synthetic assets, but also for the whole of Maker. Yeah, some questions?
Yeah, just curious about the collateralization. So with DAI, you're over-collateralizing in Ether or other volatile assets. This reverse process, how are you going to collateralize that? And is over-collateralization, I'm assuming, is part of that. How are you going to ensure buffers from some downside of short selling?
Sorry, can you repeat the last part?
Yeah, essentially you have uncapped exposure, right? So if someone sells short, there's like unlimited downside, right? So how do you deal with that scenario?
So I mean, we're talking about the capped sort of upside, like the fact that you can, because that's actually interesting.
You have unlimited exposure with capped collateral in your system. So how would you deal with that?
Yeah. So Rune, I think it may help if you kind of explain it like I'm 5 step-by-step process of how do you go short on something, right? How do you obtain some amount of leverage using a CDP? And I think that will kind of clear up a lot on, and answering like how is the upside capped, how is it not capped? Right?
Yeah. But it's definitely an important point to keep in mind that actually there is like a cap on it because of over-collateralization. So maybe that's what you're referring to. But yeah. Let me try to explain, like in simple terms, how exactly you sort of create, let's say, synthetic ETH, right? Because that's actually something that people want. I mean, and there are some products out there already that's like creating reverse ETH and this kind of stuff. And you can basically do the same thing with, with like the multi-collateral Dai system and synthetic assets built on it. So basically, what you do is that you have some Dai, and that's kind of like your collateral token, right? So you take, let's say, 100 Dai, put it into a synthetic asset CDP, and then you draw, let's say, $50 worth of synthetic ETH out of that. So now you have, let's say in a hypothetical scenario where the price of ETH is, well, what is it, like 200, let's say it's just 200, right? It's about 200 right now. So that would mean you draw out like a quarter synthetic ETH, and you now have 1/4 synthetic ETH sort of denominated debts in this CDP. And then you have a price feed that constantly basically monitors like what is the value of the debt, right? Or rather, what is the, actually it would sort of think in terms of the value of the synthetic assets. It would say like how much ETH is the 100 Dai collateral worth? Well, that's half an ETH. And my debt right now is 1/4 of an ETH. So we're still at 200x, like 200% collateralization. So we're good. But what would then typically happen is probably not that the price of the dollar would like crash relatively to ETH, but it'd be more like the price of ETH would increase. And that's exactly right. That's where we get to this like the margin calls and of this system. They're all concerned with like price increases in assets. And also there's this like phenomenon of actually like a black swan event in a synthetic asset, and basically the capped upside. So basically, let's say that the price of ETH goes from 200 to 400, right? So you go from a quarter of an ETH being worth $50 to $100. Now you suddenly have exactly the same amount of collateral to debt. So that's obviously, I mean, according to like basic maker logic, that's obviously very bad, right? Because that means like we're actually at the point where if the price of the ETH just goes up a little bit more, the whole thing, like now the whole thing is insolvent, right? So somewhere along the way, at whatever percentage, like whatever liquidation ratio is set for the synthetic asset, which like might mirror very closely exactly what the risk parameters would be for using ETH as collateral to generate DAI in the first place in sort of the primary multi-collateral system. So then there basically has to be a margin call, so like a liquidation, and that's just like the auction mechanism we were talking about before. And that's actually how the system then runs itself, because then it does like an auction where it like tries to buy back synthetic ETH and is willing to sell the DAI collateral, and ultimately try to keep the synthetic assets solvent this way. But then ultimately, so to get to the last part, the capped upside, there is a possibility of like a black swan event type thing in synthetic assets, which basically means that there just isn't enough collateral to back all the outstanding synthetic assets because they've basically gone up too much in value in too short a time period. And then what happens is it's just it's like capped upside, basically, that you do an emergency shutdown, like a global settlement of the synthetic asset, and everyone holding a synthetic asset are then settled out at that moment in time where basically the system runs out of collateral to back all the synthetic assets. And this ultimately represents itself as some sort of like maximum upside over some duration of time, basically. And it's like, and that's one of the big downsides with synthetic assets really in general, right? I mean, in the sort of derivatives as well in the real world, right? Where if you got the paper asset, but not the real asset, like in the end, you really, like, the paper really is only backed by some dollars, or like some currency value somewhere. So eventually, if you sort of hit the maximum of the collateral that's backing your synthetic asset, that's the most you can get out of that contract, essentially, or like from that system.
Does this mean that in theory you could do this with single collateral DAI, right? You could issue sort of synthetic ETH right now.
Oh yeah, absolutely. In fact, like, I mean, the fact that we're using multi-collateral DAI, I mean, actually I won't get into why it's like there is a multi-collateral aspect to synthetic assets, but that's actually that's like even further out in the future. So theoretically, yeah, I mean, you can think of it as just as a single collateral asset.
What synthetic assets do you think will be more popular initially? Like, what are the first applications that you can think of?
So in terms of what we are going to create first, actually we don't even call it synthetic assets because we call it synthetic fiat. But basically the first step is just creating other currencies. So euro is going to be the very first one, and then potentially another synthetic fiat we're looking at that's very exciting is the Ghana CEDI, because it turns out that there's a ton of like fintech adoption in Ghana, and there's actually a number of projects there that they want to like adopt. They want to move over to like a proper decentralized banking system and utilize the advantages of that. Yeah, and that's actually something I'm going to do some talks about later in terms of like using how you can use Maker in the developing world, right, and what kind of advantages it gives you. But in terms of real interesting, like the synthetic assets, sort of from the more speculative point of view, it may be that ETH is like the very first one we want to make. But I think in terms of what people are excited about, it would be something like, I mean, something like a bunch of indices. So it could be a real estate index, it could be the SP 500, other types of assets like this, like these like big kind of like indices, and just like very popular stuff that everyone is like, oh yeah, that's some easy stuff I wanna have exposure to. But actually, if you only have access to the blockchain, it may not actually be that easy for someone to get access to these things. And actually, back to the whole developing world thing, that's actually where it can, like, there's something interesting, because there are places in the world where, like, no matter what you do, if you're just some regular person, you actually just cannot get access to like the SP500 or some regular, like something that the people in the first world can easily invest in.
So if you're thinking about things like S&P 500, and that's typically something you want to hold over like a long period of time, and where like the capped upside might be an issue, is there a way to like top up the collateral? Like, so if I have an S&P, like synthetic S&P coin, someone else can top up the collateral and keep the thing growing over like a decade period, right?
Yeah, that's a great point, because that mechanism is completely sort of built automatically into the system. So when we're talking about capped upside, it's entirely like capped upside over a duration of time, in a sense, right? So it's exactly like, I mean, it's exactly like when you look at DAI remaining stable over the 80% crash of ETH, right? Where then we went out and said, this is totally normal, like this is totally to be expected, because the system is only vulnerable to like an extreme crash in a very short period of time. Where if it's just, I mean, something like the S&P 500 is something where I think by setting the risk parameters correctly, there's really, like, it's very unlikely that it would ever run into sort of this, like, freak accident where it spikes too much in value and the collateral isn't able to keep up. But in general, the people who short the asset, they will always have, I mean, for the same reasons why the people who hold CDPs right now, they have this incentive to top up their collateral. That exact same dynamic will apply to synthetic assets.
Can you talk a little bit about the governance side of things? Like as I understand it, maker holders are not affected if the risk parameters or like the collateralization breaks for synthetic assets, right? Are they still involved in setting those parameters for synthetic assets?
Yeah, so that's a really key point, that synthetic assets are not insured by MKR holders. So if you have this black swan event type scenario, you really do just get like an isolated emergency shutdown in a single synthetic asset without like bankrupting the entire like maker system and printing tons of maker to try to like bail out people's gains. Because I mean, both because that would be highly risky, but also because it's not really, like, it just seems kind of wrong basically to bail out like extreme gains. It seems like something that should only be used when it's about protecting people's stability. So that means that from the point of view of MKR holders, synthetic assets is great because they're like, they represent that extra use case and the whole new universe of financial engineering with the system. But without that like risk of, or like without that like responsibility of fundamentally like underwriting the asset. However, there still has to be someone to actually govern the synthetic assets, right? So basically, I mean, what we rely on is just that it's going to be MKR holders that are going to do it. At least from the point of view of like what the foundation is going to like push out of synthetic assets. An interesting point though is that anyone can make synthetic assets, right? Like anyone can. The code is open source, right? So like anyone can just take the multi-collateral Dai code, deploy it, like have it like initially deployed with some risk parameters and like whitelisted Dai as a collateral, and then choose some target price feed, and then it's there. Like you have a synthetic asset, and it's not really like, it's not a permission thing, or like it's not something where sort of the core maker system has to sign off on this being possible or something like that. In practice though, it is a good, like, I mean, the foundation does plan to like really push this and like make sure that it's done in a very responsible and safe fashion and so on, and that will ultimately rely on maker governance. And yeah, like, so it's actually like a pure upside scenario for MKR holders. So they're still going to have some risk parameters that will result in income for the synthetic assets. So there is going to be a stability fee on generating like the synthetic assets with your Dai collateral. So kind of like, yeah, like an interest rate over time denominated in the synthetic asset that then ultimately goes into like a pool, just like a pool of value, just like it does in multi-collateral Dai, and that ultimately can actually result in buy and burn of MKR. But it should be set very, very low because MKR holders don't take any risk.
So I think you painted this vision where Maker becomes a platform or a factory, if you world for all sorts of synthetic assets. Does DAI play any sort of critical role within this ecosystem, or was its purpose mostly, to act as like the first synthetic asset that was created?
Yeah, so DAI sits at the center of all this, right? Because the point is that with synthetic assets, the reason why we can do all these different synthetic assets and we can actually make very liquid markets for them is because we've already solved the initial and the hardest step, which is to create stability in the first place. Because once you have stability, it's actually a lot easier to go from that. I mean, it's a lot easier to create synthetic gold, for instance, if you're backing it by the US dollar or something like that has equivalent value to the US dollar. Because then when you're making markets here and you're like doing the transaction of shorting the gold, for instance, you can just go to your broker and go long gold against the US dollar there. And that's really the big advantage. So we only have to construct this like highly complex, highly diversified collateral portfolio once with multi-collateral Dai itself. And then from there can easily like grow out all these various sort of more simple and more one-off specific use cases of the technology to whatever synthetic assets people want.
So will DAI act as a collateral for all these other synthetic assets?
Yeah, that's exactly the point. Yeah, so it's like, and yeah, so you go from your initial the value or sort of the stability of the overall system really always flows from the highly diversified collateral portfolio of DAI itself, right? And then from that highly diversified collateral portfolio, you go to DAI, which is the ultimate stable asset and so on, right? That has all these like highly desirable properties in terms of stability. So once you have that asset as your collateral, that's where you can create these really interesting synthetic assets that basically, if they're over-collateralized by DAI, that's like a really strong synthetic asset because it's fully decentralized, it's like fully transparent and all this stuff, and you can see the DAIs right there sitting in the smart contract, and ultimately like trace the value back to the diversified collateral portfolio of DAI itself.
If Maker becomes like the best platform for these synthetic assets, then you'd assume at some point some of those synthetic assets would be collateral for DAI, right? If you want to if you want to diversify DAI, is that something you eventually consider? And it feels like if you do that, you have all the second order risks you probably putting in your system. Yeah.
So it doesn't create any diversification for DAI to use a synthetic asset as collateral. But yeah, because you're not protecting yourself from black swan risk, right? Because the only way to protect yourself from black swan risk is like to have all this like external stability that you can sort of draw on, and anything that's circular, obviously, like it doesn't necessarily introduce more risk to the collateral portfolio, although it can, but it never like diversifies it further. But we still do want to use synthetic assets as collateral, though, but not for the sake of stability, but for the sake of liquidity. So it's basically to make it possible to both go long and short a synthetic asset, right? You want to both be able to short it by using DAI as collateral, but you also want to be able to go long this synthetic asset by generating DAI from it. And ultimately, what's just really important here, I mean, this is some very advanced stuff, right? I mean, now we're looking pretty far out in the future where the governance is like very mature and there has to be like really solid models for all this kind of stuff. But ultimately, you can just like model the risk basically and ensure the diversification is there and then set the risk parameters correctly, like with everything else.
Yeah, just a comment. I mean, hearing you talk about creating stability out of baskets of assets, my mind goes back to collateralized debt obligations, like mortgages, and all the problems that those created. I'm sure you know all this, but it's also quite funny that there was a particularly poisonous version called a CDO squared, which was a collateralized debt obligation, or collateralized debt obligations. And I think that was the idea that you just
and I think, I mean, that's a very important point, right? Because, I mean, and I think that really that's very, I mean, I don't think that's even, like that type of concern has to be confined to like synthetic assets. Really, like, just with Maker itself and like DAI, the very basic DAI model, it is, you know, like there is always that risk of ultimately what drove the financial crisis was something like, you know, almost like a too good to be true type mentality where, you know, if you can like make it look stable, like make it look like a good idea, then everyone's so incentivized to be like, yeah, I mean, we're making tons of money, this is great, let's just like keep going with what's going on right now, right? And so I don't think that actually it's right to really blame the financial crisis on a particular type of like financial engineering, because ultimately it could have been anything. I mean, bubbles can be like any crazy thing you do, right? And I mean, of course, applying derivatives to it obviously makes everything a lot worse because it makes it a lot more complex and kind of like leverages it. But ultimately, like the true sort of cause of this kind of stuff is just like sort of the mentality of like greed and kind of at this like in particular, and in case any of you have seen The Big Short, like the thing I really always like focus on is this scene where they're talking about like all these mortgages and stuff, and they're like, who's actually looked at the underlying, right? I mean, who's looked at the actual specific assets in these like CDOs and in the mortgage-backed securities and so on. And that's kind of that's the thing, that's the point where you have a real problem, right? When you have people just like blindly trusting and kind of like relying on the ratings and that kind of stuff and not actually looking at the data directly. And it is that single characteristic that Maker is really all about, right? Because it's about like creating that like direct, you know, tokenized, blockchain verified transparency and one-to-one sort of link between what you sort of think you have, so that could be DAI or that could be a synthetic asset or something, and ultimately what you actually have, right? Which is sort of the fully traced back stability that you're drawing from these external collateral types of some sort, right? And so what's critical is you must have that like absolutely clear and direct view as a holder of the asset to every single sort of component of the underlying collateral portfolio, which I think is something that just also wasn't present basically in the mortgage-backed securities. So I think there's like, I mean, there were some people who actually would have exposure to them who literally had no way of like verifying their exposure, but just trusting the, you know, the broker or whatever. And of course, I mean, that's what we really have to like deal with. I mean, more than anything else, kind of like as the primary focus of the whole, like, I mean, in particular the governance community, right? So the people regulating Maker is like, I mean, the biggest risk to Maker is basically that same kind of like mentality of, if we can make money from this, why do we do we really have to like question it too much, or should we just make the easy money kind of? And the mentality always has to be, we have to actually prove it's sound, right? And we have to actually, not just that, but we have to like create, you know, we have to prove it to ourselves, and we have to make the data and sort of the transparency available to everyone at all times, so anyone can always look at it. And only then can you get any sort of like safety and I mean, that's the only way you can actually avert, like the risks of like, I mean, the chance that hidden risks will build up over time, right, and crash the whole thing. Which, that is totally a risk of Maker in general, right? That can be like a failure of governance if basically people aren't able to do that. And the good news is that it's very clear. I mean, there's this the MKR dilution mechanism, right? And like the fact that people have to sort of put their money where their mouth is, and this skin in the game and all this stuff, like that makes it very clear that ultimately you're not going to win out in the long run if you start doing these like, like cheap tricks or whatever, like let's make a synthetic asset and use it as collateral and make some more synthetic assets and like some squared synthetic, and we can take tons of fees and it's great and everyone loves it because they feel like they're making free money. But somewhere in there is like some hidden build-up of risk, and then like the whole thing crashes. That causes your MKR to become worthless. So as an MKR holder, that's like the last thing you want to happen, right? You always want to ensure that it's super clear and like super, it's like it really has to make sense, and it has to be possible to explain why it makes sense and sort of prove it with evidence. So yeah, I mean, that's obviously that whole topic of like the philosophy of governance is obviously something that's very important, especially as we get into these synthetic assets. And I think as a very first step, what's very important is really, more than anything else, is just like limiting the exposure of them, right? So it's about the debt ceilings, and that's kind of what we say very often when we talk about risk management of Maker, right? Is that like it's not so much about like the individual parameters of a particular asset or like how to actually regulate it from sort of an efficiency point of view, but it's really about like setting the debt ceiling correct and ensuring that no matter what, we can never accept more than blah blah, like X% of the stability of the whole system to be backed by this particular thing over here. So it would be the same thing with like with synthetic assets. Is like no matter what if the size of Maker as a whole is $100 million, we should not have more than, let's say, $5 million worth of synthetic assets or something, right? Because we don't want to have this like crazy buildup of, like, we don't want the proportion of these things to create a chance to, like, a possibility of imbalance. Up there, sorry.
Yeah, can you speak to the regulatory risk and like who bears that? And certain synthetic assets obviously will bear scrutiny, and how you guys are just thinking about that.
Yeah, I mean, so that's a really good question, and that's really other than the governance question, the regulatory questions around this is obviously one of the really, probably the biggest deal. And so the core assumption that really exists with all, like the core regulatory assumption, like the core regulatory approach that Maker really has to everything is that regulation happens on a transactional basis, right? So regulation is about governing sort of the offering of some sort of service or something to an end user, right? And that's what the regulators want to do is they want to protect certain kinds of end users from certain types of transactions that could potentially harm them and will, and for that reason, like, falls under that jurisdiction. So what I mean with that is that it's not, the regulation doesn't apply to like the code or like the open source libraries or the code or even like the deployed smart contracts that are just running on a blockchain. It only applies the moment, like regulation applies to when someone accesses it in some way, and specifically what interface they use, right? So basically we actually don't know yet, because we're still in dialogue with regulators just about like the very basic understanding of how the simple version of multi-collateral Dai works, right? And regulators are very, they take their time. At the same time, they're also very, what we have found is really that when regulators they look at this kind of stuff, they're very much like, they really try to actually like understand it and make the right decisions. That is what they desire to do, and then sometimes they fail to understand and they make a wrong decision, but it's never on purpose. Like, they actually do want to do what's best, both from the point of view of growth in ecosystem and like supporting innovation, but of course also from like protecting people from fraudulent, investment propositions, tokens or something. But when it comes to synthetic assets specifically, what we are expecting is that this will be regulated kind of like on an interface to interface, like at the interface level, basically. So that could be something like a particular maybe there's some jurisdictions who would be like, well, it's decentralized, so according to the law, that something like it's not a derivative because according, the law defines derivatives as blah blah, some illegal thing, and just like falls through, as we actually see in many, like there are many jurisdictions where like crypto just falls through, basically, right? Like there's just no law that applies to it, and then the politicians are basically like, let's create new laws for this, but until they do that, there's kind of like just a void, which is actually really bad, because then it's just uncertainty until it's actually created. But other places, they will just be like, they could very easily be like, well, this thing looks kind of like a derivative, so if you want to offer that to end users and you want to like sell them synthetic assets that act like this and we consider derivatives, you have to be licensed to deal derivatives. And then it just falls under those kind of existing regulations. And that basically means that the interface that you access it in will have to be some sort of regulated dealer of some sort, right? Which, yeah. It's kind of similar to how token, like coins and stuff in general is regulated in some places, right? Where like you need a license to sell Bitcoin, basically.
I think the issue that you're dealing with is that tokens and what we are doing, a lot of us in the space are doing, is that it's not specifically regulated. So because it's a new class of thing, it's not specifically regulated, so there's uncertainty about which laws apply, which means potentially that all the laws apply. I think if you guys want to move forward, it's easier to get into a specific class of regulation in a specific jurisdiction, so there's complete legal certainty of what the outcomes are. I mean, it's sort of like unit testing for code, but legal unit testing. And that is generally how you should structure the project, so there's absolutely no uncertainty about liquidation, because what you have is then you have the conflict of laws. For example, you issue a US DAI against DAI, and then against another asset, you have potentially 3 different jurisdictions that could fight over this, which is what happened in Lehman Brothers, which took 10 years to unwind across,
Yeah, I mean, that's actually, I mean, anything could, like it's really impossible to predict, right? I mean, there was a time where people actually thought that Bitcoin would be made illegal, right? And really it is literally impossible to predict, because this is not like, there's no like logic to it ultimately, right? It's politics in the end. So it's kind of like, a lot of this stuff really comes down to like the individual, like so the mood that someone woke up on one day, basically, and then that can have like a butterfly effect on what kind of regulatory action is ultimately taken in the end of some particular project. Most likely that's not going to happen, right? Because there's a lot of checks and balances, and like I said, regulators ultimately do want to like do what's best. But it's definitely true that there is this very real uncertainty existing right now in terms of regulation. But again, I mean, I think what's important to basically realize is that it's always, I mean, it is ultimately applied on a transactional basis, right? So it is a matter of what happens when you actually offer a synthetic asset. And so that means when you, when you want to go out and actually offer a synthetic asset in an interface, that's where you basically have to have some sort of sign off from a regulator if you want to be safe. Unless, I mean, or you can have a legal opinion, right? So it could be that there's a very strong case that this particular asset is currently unregulated in some particular jurisdiction, and you can actually have a law firm be like, we'll make a legal opinion on that. Otherwise, you have to take a dialogue with a regulator, right? And then what you want to do is you want to exclude, you want to block anyone from places where you don't feel safe, like where you could potentially be interacting with an end user that would then cause another regulator somewhere else to be like, well, this is, I mean, actually that's one thing. So one thing is actually what the regulators want to do. But actually I think actually the key risk that also a lot of projects overlook is individual lawsuits, basically. So it's not so much like that a regulator comes and like strikes you down. It's actually that you sell a synthetic asset to some guy, and then the next day he's like suing you for basically frivolously, but ultimately with the law on his side, because he's saying, well, I'm a US citizen and this was illegal, so I'm going to sue you and take all your money. And that's always like a risk that exists. And we're seeing a lot of, I mean, we're also seeing with ICOs, right, how they try to handle that, like for instance, with the US, right, which is often considered like one of the higher risk jurisdictions for this, for just like everything, right, like where it's a very aggressive jurisdiction when it comes to lawsuits, right? That like there was a time when people would just IP block projects, would just IP block US citizens, and then eventually they like very quickly moved to like really stringent KYC methodology to just like really exclude Americans from ICO offerings.
So can you imagine that sort of KYC validation always happening at the interface level, meaning the token itself would be permissionless, and if like, I don't know, I'm in Ghana and I ping you and like you can still send it to me wallet to wallet like any other ERC20? Is that like the structure?
I mean, so that's how the underlying mechanism works, right? The question is if the interface will allow you to do that.
Yeah. But I mean, if you have if say you buy this synthetic token and like you're legit, it's an ERC20 which you could just transfer to anyone, or when you talk about the interface, do you talk about the implementation of those synthetic assets, or like more the decentralized exchange on which you trade them?
Yeah, I mean, I'm talking about the smart contracts themselves will be fully decentralized, right? So there'll be no because once you put a backdoor in, like that's something that's very clear, is that like it's actually a lot worse from sort of a risk and also even a regulatory point of view to like have anyone controlling that, because the moment you have any sort of centralized backdoor, then you're just clearly the issuer yourself, right? And you're just running the thing. But when it's decentralized, it's like then it really becomes like if you have any sort of a front end access to it, then obviously you are like providing access to this, right? So that's where it you have to just follow, like you have to do whatever the regulator tells you to do then, or whatever what the law tells you to do. Otherwise, you'll get sued either by the regulator or by some person you offer the service to. And it is possible that it literally will not, like there will be places where they will not even allow an interface to like let someone go in, buy a synthetic asset and actually transfer it out of the custodial wallet, for instance. But I think in general though, what's like clearly going to happen is that institutions that are already regulated, so like financial institutions or even banks or something, they will be totally free to like send this stuff amongst themselves, right? Because they have everything covered, so like there's no risk for them to like basically send around ERC20 tokens amongst each other when it's just like a B2B interaction between regulated partners. And when it comes to retail users, it's like it's very complex, and like I said, basically we don't even really know what's going to happen to DAI itself. Although we're positive about how, again, regulators do actually see and want to understand the benefits of decentralized technology. But I expect it'll be very different from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So I'm sure that there will be some places where they're like, no synthetic assets for regular people under any circumstances because it's dangerous. And then there's going to be places where there just is no regulation. In like developing countries where it's just like there's just no regulation of this stuff at all, and this is like a way for subsistence farmers to to invest their money for the first time ever or something, right? Which is a completely different use case, right? We will just build the core technology basically, and we'll have like the maker community sort of regulate the underlying risk of it, and then very methodically go out and actually try to see what happens in terms of regulation of it.
So it might be a very obvious question, but to make the system work, keep getting the price of the asset. How do you get the price from the market? For example, the example is given. You get from Coinbase, Prime, and the price of the exchange. How do you solve the problem?
This is the same problem as with how to get the price of collateral in multi-collateral Dai itself. So basically the solution right now is to have MKR holders, so MKR governance, choose like a large set of trusted oracles and then take the median of their value output and then apply a delay, some sort of delay on that, like this price feed that's created, and then ultimately have the ability to do an emergency shutdown within this delay. So basically, if the oracles are compromised and there's bad data sent into the system, there's like a chance to shut everything down and say that, like, do a sanity check on everything that's coming in and abort if it looks like it's going to go bad.
So is this going to be a smart contract, or will it have a stop switch? Somebody can.
Yeah, so.
Sorry, before we answer that question, the lunch and networking session has started. If everyone wants to get up to that, I would stay no choice.
Let me just answer that. Like, so now we're getting into the security setup and like emergency shutdown, emergency oracles, price feed oracles. And it's really like it touches on some very basic sort of game theory of how to keep Maker as a whole safe. So yeah, this is really relevant for the core system of Maker in particular, and actually less relevant for synthetic assets, where having synthetic assets in general are a little bit more. They obviously do not have the same level of like extreme security requirements that a global stablecoin would have to go for. So So basically, there's like multiple layers of this kind of security, and ultimately the logic is that you'd rather have like you'd rather shut down the system too often, basically, than too few times, right? Like it should never be possible under any circumstances that someone actually loses their money due to like some cryptoeconomic or technical attack against the system. So basically, the answer is the ability to shut down the system is both going to be possible to do by holders of like or by like trusted emergency oracles, basically. So like actors that are basically tasked with like monitoring the system and then having the ability to shut it down. And what's important to understand is that they don't have any special abilities to actually affect the system beyond just shutting it down, which doesn't actually cause any, like all it does is sort of unwind the system at the net present value of everyone's exposure to it. So, I mean, obviously it causes a very annoying user experience issue where people have to go through like an upgrade or like kind of like they sort of have to move over to a new deployment, basically. But it's not a way to steal money from anyone. So it doesn't give like the people with disabilities some power or like some trust to actually access value in the system. And in addition to these people who are trusted with the ability to do an emergency shutdown, MKR holders themselves are just also able to do it. Exactly how it isn't even decided yet. And it's entirely up to governance over time to like decide how these permissions are done. And also it can be something like, it can be a multi-sig or it can be something more complex than that. All of that is possible to actually like create and vote in over time through the governance process of the system. All right, so that was 45 minutes.
Just about. So let's wrap it up. I know you guys must be hungry. So thank you for coming out.